And hello and welcome to A Book at Bedtime, a Storyranger Presents production. Tonight we are going to be reading the finale of the Hardy Boys Detective Handbook, or at least the finale of the story part. There are, one, two, three, four, five. There are 5 additional chapters that do not feature Frank and Joe, but are just out of date information about street drugs, police terminology, law enforcement and practicing law, and how to do surveillance and find fingerprints. Again, all of it wildly out of date. This book was originally published in the 50s and then was updated in the 70s. Not because they had new information, but because the original expert that was consulting on it was indicted for corruption. He was later found not guilty, but still. And so they had to get a new expert. So the text, I think, is copyright 1966, and then they redid the art in 1972. So that's the version that I have. There's apparently another version in the 80s, but I think they just edited, because this book is like thicker than the regular ones. Apparently, I don't know. This one looks like all the other ones. But originally, like, the original book was a lot thicker. So when you put it on a shelf with the rest of your Hardy Boys books, it stood out. I mean, it's a different color, so, like, it's gonna stand out anyway. But no, apparently they wanted it to be a uniform thickness. Which, like, whatever. Okay. So, tonight we will begin with Chapter 5, The Secret of the Empty Page, The Powers of Observation and Memory. Fenton Hardy rose to his feet after examining the prone figure of a policeman on the roadway. "This is terrible," he said. "He's been shot to death." The detective turned to Frank and Joe and their pal Chet Morton. "Joe, jump in my car and call Chief Colleague." The crime scene area was a lonely stretch of the winding old road along the creek between Bayport and Center City. Mr. Hardy and the 3 boys were on their way for an afternoon of fishing when they had come upon the victim. No one else was in sight. The policeman was lying face down in the center of the road, his head in the direction of Bayport. His crash helmet had fallen off and had rolled a short distance away. A notebook and pen were in the dust near the body. The right officer's hand was extended over his head, still clutching his revolver. His motorcycle was parked on the right side of the road approaching Bayport. The engine was running. As was his usual custom, Mr. Hardy took notes and made a rough sketch of the scene. Joe returned and told his father that Chief Colleague was on the way. Remember before smartphones when you had to, like, just stop and sketch the scene? You couldn't just take out your phone and video it? Those were terrible times. I don't miss those times. Joe returned and told his father that Chief Colleague was on his way. Within minutes, a screaming chorus of police sirens could be heard. 3 cars roared to a halt. Almost before they stopped, the chief was out on the road. He hurried over to the body and stared at it in shocked disbelief. Then he said in a choked voice, "That's my nephew, Tom Colleague. Joined the department a few weeks ago. How can I tell his wife and his 3 kids that he's dead?" He turned to the elder Hardy. "What happened?" "I don't know, Chief," Mr. Hardy said softly, "but it appears that he was shot twice in the back." Colleague nodded grimly. "Ezra," Mr. Hardy added, "I want you to know how sorry I am. I'll do anything to help." "Thank you, Fenton. I'll never rest until I catch the murderer." Meanwhile, Officer Higgins took photographs of the crime scene from several angles. As he did, the Bayport First Aid Squad arrived, followed by the city ambulance. A white-coated intern examined the victim and officially pronounced Tom Colleague dead. The body was put in the ambulance. Mr. Hardy and the police officers made a thorough search of the crime scene. They scoured both sides of the road for a considerable distance with negative results. The roadway itself yielded no clues either. While the men were busily engaged, Frank and Joe decided to walk along the road towards Center City. Chet followed behind them. After passing a sharp bend, he asked, "Why are you walking all the way up here?" "Because you never know when you'll find a clue," Frank replied. "But there is nothing." Let's go back, Chet said. At that moment, Frank and Joe stopped dead in their tracks. Chet, Joe asked, do you mean to tell me that you don't see anything unusual? Chet looked about and shrugged. Are you kidding? There's nothing but a few pieces of glass near that pole. Joe pointed to the left. Not only are there a few pieces of glass, but if you look a little higher, you'll notice a scrape mark on the pole. That could mean a car speeding from Center City sideswiped it. So? Chet asked. If you come closer to the pole, Joe continued, you can see what appears to be dark blue paint scrapes where it was struck. You're right. How come you notice all these things? We've been trained by Dad to observe, Frank replied. The power of observation, Chet, is based on our 5 senses: sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. The 2 that we use most are sight and hearing. It's a known fact that a modern man does not use his 5 senses to their full capacity. As a matter of fact, Joe put in, Dad says that people walk around completely oblivious to many things they see. Let me give you a concrete example. He took Chet by the shoulders and turned him about. You've been with us all morning, he said. What color shirt do I have on? Chet scratched his head. I'll have to take a guess. Blue? Chet turned to face Joe. The shirt was green with white stripes. Uh-oh, I goofed. Joe continued. There are a couple of good tests to show how dormant your capability to observe may be. You pass the intersection of Main and Linden Streets every day. Tonight, before you go to bed, picture what it looks like and write down these impressions. Tomorrow when you go there, you'll be surprised at how many you missed and how many incorrect impressions you have listed. Joe turned to Frank. I think you better get Dad and Chief Colleague to look at this poll. It may be a clue. I'll tell Chet some more about observation. As Frank sprinted down the road, Joe went on, Chet, when you have some time, sit down and write as full a description as you can of some of your friends, teachers, and acquaintances. Keep the descriptions in your pocket. Oh, that doesn't sound at all like somebody's going to accidentally drop these and they'll land in the hands of their friends and their friends will get mad. This doesn't sound at all like what happened in Emily of New Moon last week. Not at all. When you meet these people, compare your notes with what you see. You'll be amazed at how inaccurate your descriptions are. Well, isn't there a way to improve one's power of observation, Chet asked. Sure, but it takes a lot of practice. I'd like to, Chet said, but how? Observation is nothing more than a series of mental images to which you apply the laws of repetition, association, attraction, or its opposite, repulsion. Here, I'll give you some examples. If I were to ask you to draw a map of France, you probably couldn't because you've never truly observed it. But I bet you could do a fair job on Italy. Why? Because the picture of a boot comes to mind. That's the association. If I ask you what 7 times 7 is, you give me the correct answer immediately because you have repeated this over and over. This is repetition. 49? 7 times 7 is 49? I don't know. I was terrible at mental math, but I could do algebra just fine, so it is with things you like. They strike your attention, leaving a permanent image. And the same applies to things you violently dislike, such as last year's math teacher. Wow, could I describe him? Another way to improve your powers of observation, Joe went on, is to look briefly at any shop window display. Turn around and write down what you saw. Compare it with the real thing and note the items you left out. Keep practicing until you become proficient. That's the way that policemen train themselves. Just then, Frank came running back. They'll be here in a minute, he said. Nodding towards Chet, he added, Joe, did you tell him about memory? No, I didn't. Just got through with observation. I'll do it then, Frank volunteered. Chet, memory works through association. We can recall a new idea only by connecting it to something we already know. We form these associations consciously and subconsciously, but it can be improved by training. At that moment, Mr. Hardy, Chief Colleague, and his men arrived. What do you make of this? The chief asked, pointing to the broken glass and the pole. Fenton Hardy bent down and examined the splinters through a hand magnifier. Then he carefully looked at the pole. The broken glass seems to be from the headlight of a car, he said finally. It's very fresh. So are the paint scrapings. How do you know the glass hasn't been here long? Chet asked. It's simple. The road is very dusty. Whenever a car drives by, a cloud of dust rises, but there's no traces of it on these fragments. Joe interrupted excitedly. Dad, this means that since the time the car hit the pole, no one else has driven past here. So the last car we passed coming from Central City must have been the one that struck the pole, and it may have something to do with Tom Colleague's murder. I remember the car, Frank cut in. We passed it only a couple of minutes before we found the body. It was going very fast. A dark blue sedan, recent model. And it had a broken right headlight and a dented fender, Joe said. There were 3 men in it. Correct, his father said. I saw it too. Not me, Chet said. I just remember the car speeding by. Chet, that's because you are the audience avatar here, meant to not know anything so that you can be taught. Come to think of it, Dad, said Joe. I looked at the license plate. It was covered with dirt, but the borders were yellow, and it was the same size as the registration plates in our state. At once, Chief Colleague radioed headquarters to set up roadblocks on all highways leading out of Bayport. He also notified police in the adjoining towns to be on the lookout for the car. Higgins took photographs of the pole and the glass. Then the pieces were meticulously picked up. Using a sharp knife, Mr. Hardy cut away the paint scrapings, which he placed into an envelope. What are you doing that for? Chet asked. If we're fortunate enough to find the headlight from which the glass came, we'll fit the broken pieces together like a jigsaw puzzle. It will be positive proof that these pieces came from the damaged headlight. The scrapings and chips of paint will be sent to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. to determine its exact composition. If we find the vehicle that scraped the pole, its paint can be compared with that on the pole to see if they're identical. As the group slowly walked back towards the waiting cars, Chet lagged behind, scanning the roadside. Suddenly, he bent over and called out excitedly, "Come here quick, I think I've discovered something." The others hurried to his side, and Chet pointed among the weeds. There lay 2 .45 caliber shells, about 3 feet apart. How did the cops not find the bullet casings? That's like the first thing you look for in a shooting death is the bullet casings, and the cops didn't find them, but Chet Morton, the dumbest character in the Hardy Boys universe, he's comically stupid in some of the books, and he finds the shell casings after having just been taught about the powers of observation 5 minutes ago by Joe. What? Who hired these police officers? Who trained these police officers? What is going on in Bayport? Good work, Chet, Frank said. Colleague called for Higgins to make a close-up photograph, and Mr. Hardy included the position of the shells in his sketch. They probably came from an automatic pistol, Joe said to Chet. You see, every time a pistol fires, its firing pin hits the primer at the base of the shell. This causes the explosion which forces out the lead bullet. The extractor hits the side of the casing and ejects the shell from the gun automatically. Chet was impressed by his friend's knowledge of firearms. When the firing pin hits the center of the primer, Joe went on, it leaves a distinct mark. If you compare a shell found at a crime scene with another from the suspected gun, and the marks are identical, you can positively state that this was the gun fired. It can also be proven by ejector marks. Does this go for revolvers too? Chet asked. Yes, but with these differences. In the first place, the revolver does not eject any shells. After firing, the shell stays in the gun and must be removed manually. For this reason, no extractor marks are on the bullet. But there's a firing pin, so you can prove that the 2 shells with matching pin impressions were fired by the same weapon. Why are the firing pin marks different in different guns? Chet wanted to know. Frank answered, when you look at any firing pin, extractor, or ejector under a microscope, you'll find definite characteristics. No 2 are alike. And then you use a comparison microscope to study both the known shell and the suspected shell. If the marks on both are exactly alike, you have made a positive identification. I see, said Chet. Is that a comparison microscope you've got in your lab? Right. Hurry, boys, Mr. Hardy called. We have a lot of work to do. Chief Colleague says the detective. I just radioed headquarters. There's no word on that sedan yet. Well, Mr. Hardy replied, I think our next step is to check all the service stations in Bayport to see if the blue car was brought in to have headlight repaired. Several police officers, along with Frank, Joe, and Chet, were assigned to check the garages. The reports were negative. As the trio trudged back towards headquarters, Joe said, Let's take a shortcut through the park. Okay, Chet agreed. The soft grass will sure be easier on my poor tired feet. He grinned. Walking along a narrow lane in Bayport Park, Chet suddenly stumbled and pitched headlong onto the side of the path. He let out a whoop that startled Frank and Joe. What's the matter, Chet? Did you hurt yourself? Frank asked. No, but look. Chet pointed to the shrubbery. Frank and Joe parted the bushes and gasped. There stood an empty blue sedan. Chet scrambled to his feet and they walked around it cautiously without disturbing anything. The right headlight was broken and the fender was smashed. Joe could hardly believe their good luck. How in the world did you see it, Chet? When I fell, I noticed tire ruts on the grass. They seemed fresh, and they led to the car. I saw it through a crack in the foliage. Frank slapped Chet on the back. You're learning fast. Then he added, we'd better get to a phone pronto. I'll go, Joe offered. You stay here to protect the evidence. He was one of the fastest men on the high school track team, and disappeared like a shot. Shortly, 2 police cars with Fenton Hardy, chief colleague, and the other members of his force arrived in the park and screeched to a halt. The examination of the sedan revealed 2 bullet holes in the rear. The chief and Mr. Hardy noticed that attempts had been made to remove all fingerprints by rubbing the car's surface with a cloth. However, they discovered a number of visible prints on the back of the rear view mirror and a latent print on the rear window. Higgins photographed and lifted them and rushed them to the fingerprint section for processing and identification. No other clues were found in the car, and it was towed to the police parking lot while everyone drove to headquarters. Chief Colleague contacted the Motor Vehicle Bureau. Within a few minutes, the teletype came back. The car had just been reported stolen by its owner, who had left it in the parking lot in Center City. Obviously, the criminals changed cars in Bayport, the chief said, and ordered that roadblocks be continued, and also that train stations, the bus terminal, and the airport be kept under surveillance. Then he said to Mr. Hardy, Fenton, let's have another look at that sketch you made of the scene of the... A knock on the door interrupted him, and Officer Riley walked into the office. When the repairman came to fix our teletype machine, he found this message stuck in it. It had been sent from Center City at 10 a.m., Chief, he said, and handed colleague a piece of paper. The chief glanced over the message, then said, Listen to this. The Center City Bank of Commerce was held up by 3 armed bandits this morning. One of them had a .45 caliber pistol. He ordered the cashier to fill a brown paper bag with bills, the robbers wore handkerchiefs over their faces, and the man with the gun had a white piece of adhesive tape above his right eye. According to the witnesses, the robbers escaped in a blue car. Dad, Joe cried out. Maybe it was the bank robbers who killed Tom Colleague. I'm sure there's some connection, Mr. Hardy said. He frowned. Ezra, do you have Tom's report book here? Sure. Chief Colleague ordered one of his men to bring it in. Mr. Hardy opened the notebook. 1 page had been torn out. Chief, the detective said softly, your nephew wrote something on that missing page. Someone did not like it. After Tom turned his back, this person shot him, tore the page out, and threw the book on the road. Tom lived long enough to fire twice at the escaping car. That's the way I see it. Now, what could he have written? Probably information from the driver's license of that person, Colleague replied. Perhaps he was going to give him a summons. Mr. Hardy examined the book again. He noticed indentations on the blank page following the missing one and squinted at it from various angles. I can make out the name and address, he said slowly, and also the license number. Amos Chipman, 142 Parade Street, New York City, W8113-47212-55343 or 484. And it goes on to say, age 42, 5 feet 8 inches, 180 pounds, adhesive patch above right eye. Now we know for sure that the driver of the car was one of the robbers who held at the bank in Center City, Frank exclaimed. Chief Colleague asked Officer Riley to telephone the New York police for information on Chipman. Mr. Hardy said, and I'll call the Center City police for fuller details on the holdup. He went into the office next to Colleague's. A few minutes later, he returned and said that the Center City police chief was sure that the blue car found in Bayport was the one used in the holdup. The driver had stopped for gasoline at the station on the outskirts of Center City. He seemed to be in a great hurry, refusing to let his windshield be cleaned. The attendant noticed the patch of adhesive over his right eye and remembered that he threw a Lozanol Pentello cigar wrapper on the pavement. Right, because gas stations are still full service at this point. Just then, Officer Riley finished his call to New York and reported that Amos Chipman had a long arrest record, beginning with larceny and including several holdups. He had been released from prison 5 months before and was wanted for violation of parole. Riley concluded that by saying that all information, including Rogue's gallery photographs, would be sent by special delivery and that Chief Colleague should have had them in the morning. Yep, special delivery because there's no email. That's the thing. I remember, no digital cameras, no this, and I keep forgetting there's no internet. So they have to mail everything. Bayport policemen, meanwhile, scoured the city for the suspects. Next morning, everyone involved in the case met at headquarters. Chief Colleague was tired and red-eyed from lack of sleep. All talked in subdued voices. "Have you checked the field interrogation reports yet?" Mr. Hardy asked him. "Sure." Colleague scowled unhappily. "There's nothing of importance." "What are field interrogation reports?" Chet asked Joe. The young sleuth explained that they were forms used by the police in progressive communities on which officers jot down anything unusual they observe while on duty. "For example," said Joe, "last year when the safe at Commonwealth Supermarket was cracked, the police could have never solved the case without an officer's field interrogation report. In this case, the policeman observed a car parked in a lot near Commonwealth late at night. It didn't seem to belong there, so he noted its license number. From there on, it was simple to break the case because it had been the burglar's car." Chet said, "I wouldn't know what to include in these reports." "It's a matter of judgment," Frank said. "For instance, a man crossing the street, tripping and grabbing his hip, may have a gun. A kid driving an expensive car may be an auto thief. So might a person moving from one parked car to another, or seen loitering near a car. A car traveling at high speed may be fleeing from a crime." "I see," said Chet. Yeah, that checks out with what I was taught to put on my security reports. I mean, a lot of the assumptions are racist nonsense and or sexist nonsense. But there's some truth to it from when I was still working security. / if I go back, there is some, a man falling and grabbing his hip could be because he has a gun. It also could be because he has, a needle or an injector. It also could just be that he's old and he's now broken his hip. It's all context and it's all judgment. And the problem is that a lot of people who go into law enforcement do not have good judgment. That was one of my things, was I was like, you know what, I may not be the most physically capable person, but I have sound judgment and reasoning skills. And while I am obviously biased, because everybody is inherently biased, I do my best to keep myself as free from those biases as possible, unless they are something that would extremely be of use in that situation. I think that's long enough of a tangent into Storyranger's career as a security guard. Joe picked up the interrogation forms and scanned them briefly. About midway through the pile, he lifted one up and called to his father, "Dad, take a look at this. It says that Patrolman McDonald observed the stranger early yesterday morning walking slowly back and forth on the opposite side of the street from the Union Bus Terminal. He crossed the street twice, but he did not go into the terminal. The officer talked to him briefly. He told McDonald that his name was Alonzo Chip, that he lived at 243 North Augusta Street, and that he was waiting for his brother to come in from Center City." Why did he tell him his address if he's just talking to him? Is the officer questioning him? Is this the stop and search era? Okay. Officer McDonald's notes gave the description of Chip as about 42 years old, 5 feet 8 inches tall, about 180 pounds. He smoked a long cigar and had a large mole over his right eye. Oh, maybe the point is that generally you wouldn't just tell a cop your address. That's a really weird thing to just say. But if you're trying to set up an alibi for yourself and you're lying, that's something you're gonna drop at every available opportunity to be like, look how honest I am, look at how open I am with all this information that I'm lying about. Trust me. Is that the point they're trying to make? Possibly. McDonald concluded his report by stating that Chip walked south on Lyons Avenue, and that was the last he saw of him. "Might be something there," observed the chief. Then he asked Riley to bring McDonald into his office. "Mac's only been on the force for a year," he said to Mr. Hardy, "and he's very meticulous with his reports. Good man." Meanwhile, the information on Chipman had arrived from New York and was handed to Chief Colleague. It contained fingerprint classification, a copy of Chipman's record, and photos. A complete description noted the following peculiarities. He frequented taverns. That's not odd. People go to bars and pubs. That's okay. All right. Had a large mole over his right eye, repeatedly scratched his nose, and smoked Lazino Pentella cigars. Chief colleague ordered Higgins to compare the fingerprints found on the sedan with those forwarded from New York. Then Officer McDonald was ushered in. When questioned about Chip, he confirmed the observations in his report and added that the man appeared nervous. He looked at the photographs from New York and studied them intently, but said he could not make a positive identification. Colleague praised the patrolman for his alertness in filing the field interrogation report. Then McDonald left. He was hardly outside the door when Officer Higgins came in excitedly. Without a doubt, he declared, the fingerprints behind the mirror and on the rear window of the blue sedan belonged to Amos Chipman. Without a doubt, it's been less than a day. Where is Bayport? Because I don't actually remember if in the original series they confirm it, but it's got to be a big enough city that it has an airport and a fingerprint export in the police headquarters. And yet it's like rural enough that they let teenagers be deputies, and that their investigative team has only 2 people qualified to photograph fingerprints, and both can get sick at once. What town is this? Where is this supposed to be? I swear... no, I will save that tangent for the hydration break. Sorry. Alright. Wow, Chet exclaimed. The case is solved. Not quite, Joe stated. We still have to catch Chipman, remember? And then the pistol must be found and identified as the gun used. And we must find out who fired it. And, Frank added, we have to recover the stolen money. Mr. Hardy held up the full-face photo of Chipman. Chief, he said, please have copies of this photograph made and give one to every police officer. Since the Lyons Avenue section has a lot of rooming houses, I would concentrate manpower in civilian clothes to scour that area. Colleague nodded. I was thinking along the same lines. Dad, what can we do? Frank spoke up. May we cover the Lyons section with the police? No, I have a special job for you. Is that special job go home because this is a murderer on the loose and you shouldn't let your teenage sons look for him? What's that? I want you to go to every store and eating place around Lyons Avenue and show the owner and employees this picture. The minute you locate someone who's seen Chipman, call me. Okay, Dad. After the boys had obtained copies of Chipman's photograph, Frank and Joe examined it carefully. Why are you doing that? Chet asked. Frank replied, here's where we use our powers of observation again, this time to create a mental picture of the man. We imprint in our minds his prominent features or peculiarities, the sharp, thin nose, the large mole over his right eye, his long head, and deep-set eyes. When we hear the name Chipman from now on, we'll associate it with this. Chet nodded. Let me see that photo for a minute. He, too, studied it. Then the trio set off for the Lyons Avenue section. It was a community of older buildings. Chet and the Hardys went from one place to another, asking questions and showing the picture. But no one had seen Chipman. They trudged in and out of stores, restaurants, diners, rooming houses, and went through the age-old experience of professional detectives, wearying legwork. Finally, Frank remarked gloomily, we're almost through and have gotten exactly nowhere. The perspiring Chet sat down on the curb. Don't you think we'd better go back, he asked. There are no clues around here. Nothing doing, Joe said. A good investigator never quits. We have 7 more places to try. At that moment, he noticed Chet staring at something on the other side of the street. He turned and saw a man walk into the grocery store they had just left. That was Chipman, Chet blurted. He sure looks tough. Are you sure? Joe could hardly believe it. Me too, Joe, me too. Positive. Okay, said Frank, I'll go in and see what he's up to. When he comes out, you 2 follow him. Okay, said Chet, and Joe nodded in agreement. Frank crossed the street and entered the store. He stood a little to the rear of the man, as if waiting for his turn. He was unable to see the suspect's face. The man was ordering a variety of cold cuts and canned goods from a prepared list he held in his hand. The stranger's manner was that of any normal customer, and Frank began to wonder if Chet had been mistaken. As the storekeeper was totaling the bill, the customer added, and I'll take a dozen Lozenzo Patella cigars, too. The words electrified Frank, and he stood rooted in the floor. rooted to the floor. His eyes fell on a suspicious bulge in the man's rear right hip pocket. Was it the death-dealing .45 caliber pistol? The suspect paid with a $20 bill, took the change and turned. Frank got a good look at him. He was Chipman, all right. "What do you have, son?" asked the shopkeeper. Concealing his excitement, Frank said in a calm voice, "A pound of sugar, please." As soon as Chipman had walked out, the storekeeper said, "Wasn't that the man whose picture you showed me?" "It was, and thanks for not giving me away. May I use your phone to call Chief Colleague?" "Sure, go right ahead." The man pointed to the wall phone, and Frank gave the police chief the information. "Be careful," Chief Colleague cautioned. "This guy is a killer. If something happens to you boys, your father will never forgive me. I'll alert all unmarked police cars. They'll be there in 1 minute. Your dad and I in 2. He hung up. Frank hurried from the store to catch up with Joe and Chet, who were following Chipman. The robber was walking at a rapid pace, and the 2 boys were a good distance ahead of Frank. Before he could reach them, he was overtaken by an unmarked police car. In it were Chief Colleague and Mr. Hardy, with Officer Riley at the wheel. Frank quickly jumped in. Knowing the neighborhood well, Colleague surmised that Chipman was on his way to a rooming house near the corner of the block. It was the only one on the street. "Fenton," he said, "I think it's best to grab him before he gets there. Once he's inside with that .45, it'll be difficult to capture him and somebody might get hurt. We'll go around the block quickly and cut through the backyard, then hide behind the house next to the rooming house. I'll radio Johnson and Carroll, who are riding ahead of us, and tell them to creep up on Chipman. When they get near, they're to jump out of the car and cover him from behind while I take him from the front. Riley, you cover for me." "Right," said Riley, and drove the car to the designated spot. "Watch yourself," Mr. Hardy said to the chief. "The force needs you." "Don't worry," Colleague replied grimly. "I have a score to settle with that scoundrel." He radioed Johnson and Carroll and outlined his plan of action. Then he and Riley got out and flattened themselves against the building with revolvers in hand. Mr. Hardy and Frank also left the car and watched the scene from a distance. Chipman came into view carrying his groceries in his left arm. A long cigar hung jauntily from his mouth. Colleague and Riley walked up to him. "Raise your hands," the chief commanded. Chipman dropped the bag and drew a pistol from his hip pocket, but he never had a chance to use it because the chief's gun spoke first. Chipman spun around with a bullet in his shoulder and fell to the sidewalk. The .45 caliber automatic clattered behind him. In an instant, he was grabbed by Johnson and Carroll, who kicked away the pistol and handcuffed the prisoner. The hardened criminal began to whine. "Don't shoot anymore, I'm dying." The chief answered grimly, "No, you're not, and you got a better break than you gave my nephew." The killer's wound proved to be superficial. While he was given first aid by the police, Chief Colleague advised him of his constitutional right to consult a lawyer before making any statement. Chipman, however, volunteered the information that his 2 buddies were living in the rooming house. Alright, so Al remains the only smart criminal in this entire book. He also told the officers that the men were unarmed and that the bank loot was in the paper bag in the bureau. The chief and his men, nevertheless, took proper precautions upon entering the house, their revolvers ready in case they had to use them. They arrested the other 2 robbers without any trouble. The bank's money was recovered, except for a small amount that the men had spent. In a written confession obtained later, Chipman admitted to shooting Officer Tom Colleague. The bank robbers were on their way to the rooming house when Colleague saw the speeding car approaching. He let it pass, then turned around to give chase. That was when Chipman whizzed around on a curve and sideswiped the pole. Colleague caught up to the sedan and Chipman stopped. He said that at first the officer was only going to give him a summons, but when he found out that Chipman had no owner's registration, Tom Colleague ordered him to follow his motorcycle to headquarters. Chipman had offered the policeman a bribe, which Colleague had indignantly spurned. When the officer turned to mount his cycle, Chipman had shot him in the back. That evening, after the criminals had been locked up, Frank, Joe, and Chet gathered in Mr. Hardy's study to discuss the highlights of the case. "What I don't understand," said Chet, "is why Chipman wore the adhesive tape when he helped at the bank." "That's easy," Joe answered. "He has a large mole over his right eye, remember? Realizing that this would identify him, he covered it with a piece of adhesive tape. Right, Dad?" "Exactly. That kind of thing has been done many times. There are also some cases on record where a criminal had no facial scar or mark, but added adhesive tape to some part of his face to confuse an observer." "You and the boys," said Chet, "have taught me a lot about observation. Now I know it's the keystone to the success of any criminal investigation." "True," Mr. Hardy replied, "and you've caught on fast. If you hadn't spotted Chipman on the street, we would still be looking for him." "Yes, Dad," Frank said with a grin, "but that's the first time I've ever heard of anybody solving a case while sitting on a curb." That is a weirdly lighthearted note to end the case on, where the man killed had a wife and 3 kids, which seems like a really weird detail to include, considering it was mentioned once and then never referenced again. Time for a hydration break. Hello. We are almost halfway through the show. I think we're actually, I think we're gonna go overtime tonight, but that's okay because we went under time on Tuesday, so you'll get a special long bonus episode. So the tangent that I kept wanting to go on but I refrained from was that I have read all 52 of the original Hardy Boys mystery stories, and none of them were as, like, frustratingly, and I know why it is. It's because, as the Wikipedia summary wrote it, like, these are written in a didactic style. Like, it's written specifically to teach a child through the story how police work works. So, like, in the usual books, they use slang, or they don't cover the part of the cops giving the person their Miranda rights, because Frank and Joe aren't there for that. Frank and Joe are already down at the diner across the street having ice cream, because they're the important characters. Like, we don't see a lot of the follow-up, whereas this point of this whole book is to be like, oh, you like watching Frank and Joe be private detectives? Like, here's how you do it yourself. And reminding you that actually a lot of it is very boring. And also, like, in the original novels, and also part of this is because I read them when I was a kid, but it's like, you know that Frank and Joe are good. Like, they're 2, like, wholesome, all-American boys who just happen to stumble into scrapes, and obviously, you know, there's 52 books, so there's at least 52 crimes that these boys somehow miraculously managed to stumble into between, technically, in 1 year, because Frank is 18 and Joe is 17, I think, for the entirety of the series. Or there might be at one point where they change ages. They might have started at 17 and 16 and then, but, like, it's all very vague, and it basically all happens when they're at the same age. So they solve 52 crimes in a year, which is crazy. But this book, because it is written in this teaching style, and it's, like, beating you over the head with that, just points out, like, these mysteries are so laughably contrived. Like, it's so contrived because they had to contrive the perfect crime for you to teach somebody with, rather than the regular series mysteries, which are so much more organic and so much more enjoyable to read. And yet, I was so obsessed with this book as a child. Maybe it was just because, like, as a child, I, like, needed that. Like, I wanted to learn, so I wanted Frank to tell me, like, everything this way. It also could be that I was just more interested in, like, the back half of the book that we're not going to read together. That could be it. Anyway, let's continue after we've hydrated. Have you hydrated, listeners? I hope you have. Let's continue with Chapter 6, The Clue of the Broken Pencil. Search of the crime scene and suspect. After a crime has been committed, the investigator must go to the scene as quickly as possible to make a search of the location. The pleasant voice was that of Fenton Hardy. He was seated in his study with Frank and Joe and instructing their pal Chet on the subject of crime scene searches. The detective continued, "The collection and preservation of physical evidence and clues to be used by investigators in solving a crime are of greatest importance. The evidence must be properly collected and preserved to meet the legal requirements, allowing its use in court when the case is tried." "Now, Frank," Mr. Hardy said, "tell Chet what has to be done at the crime scene." "The basic rule," replied the dark-haired boy, "is to protect the scene. This means that no one is allowed to enter the area except for the officers who will process it for evidence. Entry of the crime scene by other persons may result in destroying, altering, moving important evidence, or in leaving new items or marks which could mislead the investigators." Next, the crime scene is recorded. The best way to start is by photographing the scene. Then sketches of it are made, and finally casts of shoe and tire prints after they have been properly photographed. Also, fingerprints have to be photographed and lifted. Frank paused, then continued. Probably the most important duty of the investigator is to make notes of all observations, evidence located, photographed, and collected. It is good practice to have one officer in charge of the crime scene search who will take notes and direct the search in a systematic manner. He will witness the location of each piece of evidence and will initial it together with the officer who discovered and preserved it. Both should also initial the notes. This way, either of them can later testify in court. It sounds complicated, Chet remarked, and a lot of equipment is needed. Not really, answered Joe. Look at this. He leaned over and picked up an attaché case. In it were an ordinary camera with a flash bulb attachment, extra bulbs and film, a clipboard with a pad of graph paper, note paper, and an engineer's scale. Also included were assorted pencils, a steel tape measure, rubber gloves, assorted empty pillboxes, plain envelopes, cellophane envelopes of various sizes, scotch tape, evidence stickers, and a compass. We call this the Hardy Crime Scene Kit, Joe told Chet. Frank spoke up. One reason we photograph a scene is for the presentation of the pictures to a judge or jury, so they can easily visualize what happened, and to settle any questions they may have in their minds concerning the crime scene. In other words, Chet said, you make photos from different angles. Right. We use a wide-angle lens first, then make close-ups of all the important pieces of evidence. Very good, said Mr. Hardy. Joe, suppose you tell Chet now about sketching the crime scene. Sure, Joe replied. Chet, first we have to decide what type of sketch would be most useful. It's also important to obtain an overall impression. For example, if the crime scene is outdoors, we must figure out how much ground to cover. There's no sense in bringing in the entire countryside if it's not important. Chet chuckled, but he became serious again as Joe continued. To record the location of evidence believed to be important, we have to decide what baseline to use, and if necessary, what fixed points. Then we measure the exact distance from these fixed points. The evidence will be charted on the graph paper. Joe stressed that all measurements must be accurate. Where the distance is great, the investigator may use pacing or an automobile speedometer. To make sure that measurements are exact, more than one officer should check the tape measure. In almost every sketch, Joe said, you have to use a scale. And, wait a minute, what do you mean by scale? Well, it's usually not possible to get a sheet of paper big enough to show the true measurements, so we scale it down. For example, we'll make 1/2 inch equal to a foot, or we use whatever scale we think is necessary in order to incorporate the measurements needed. This goes for both indoor and outdoor locations. I see. Go on, Chet said. Frank took up the explanation. On the sketch, we show the exact location according to scale of all important evidence, the approaches and entrances to the room or the area, the size of the area, and the position of the windows or doors. Other things will be recorded, Frank said. Other things to be recorded, Frank said, are the title, which is a brief descriptive heading, for example, Homicide of John Doe, the address or location, an arrow pointing north, the date the sketch was made, and who made it. In order not to clutter the sketch with writing, Mr. Hardy pointed out, symbols and numbers are used in the legend. The general rule is to use letters for furniture and fixed articles, and numbers for items of evidence. Joe, who was watching Chet nod his head, said mischievously, How about regular coordinates and triangulations? Chet grinned. I'll take a dozen. We use those two methods, Frank said, to pinpoint evidence on a sketch. We usually take the rectangular coordinates when we have rectangular lines. For instance, the walls of a room. In order to locate the evidence, we draw a dotted line from it to any side. Then at a right angle to this line, and from the evidence, we draw another line to an adjoining side. Then, wait a minute, interjected Mr. Hardy. This whole thing must sound like Greek to Chet. Suppose you take this piece of paper and illustrate it by drawing as you talk. Okay, Dad, Frank said, and drew a sketch. See? He said to Chet, we identify the violation, the residence, the room, show the date, our initials, and the compass reading of the room. Then we indicate the corners of the room with capital letters and the location of the evidence as 1. Next, we draw perpendicular lines to the west and south walls which intersect at 1. This geographically locates 1 in the room and permits us to relocate 1 at any time in the future by making the same 2 simple measurements. So that's the little map that he draws out. So you're just plotting it on the X and Y axis of the room if you have a square room. I get it, said Chet. Actually, the dotted lines you drew are coordinates, each parallel with the walls that meet. So if you measure north on the west wall from corner D, 5 feet, and east from D on the south wall, 8 feet, the lines or coordinates drawn perpendicular to these points would intersect at 1, or where the evidence was located. That's right, Chet, said Mr. Hardy. I learned it in math class, Chet remarked. I thought you hated your math class. Was it just the teacher? Now I'll tell you about triangulation, continued Frank. It's probably the most useful method of locating a specific point. It can be applied indoors, but usually it's applied to an outdoor crime scene. It's based on locating 2 permanent fixed points from which the location of a third temporary point is determined. For example, in this sketch, we know that the corners, the doorway, the heating vents, or the radiators are fixed points. Therefore, if we measure corners D and C to point 1, that point can always be relocated with respect to D and C. Let me illustrate this further. Frank made another sketch. You see, he went on, point 1 is the only place at which lines C and D will intersect within the room using the original length measured for each line. So that's how to do it in a square room. And then presumably they'll teach you how to triangulate outside. Let me illustrate this further, Frank made another sketch. You see, he went on, point 1 is the only place in which lines C and O. Now let's consider the application of triangulation outdoors. We must always select 2 permanent points of reference, similar to the corners D and C in the sketch that I just made. Some of the better outdoor reference points are survey marks, fire hydrants, and drain sewers because records of their location are maintained by local and county agencies. Utility poles are excellent too, and of course, there are other points. It's up to the investigator to pick the best ones. Frank quickly drew a third sketch. You see, he went on, to locate the evidence on this drawing, we simply measure south from utility pole number US7K2 to X and westward from the fire hydrant to X. So there's a little... And see, you don't use the dead tree as a point because people might come and remove the dead tree. An experienced investigator would never select either the old fence post or the dead tree as a reference point because they may soon rot away or be removed. In this case, it would be hard to draw a scale. However, the sketch can be reproduced on a scale map of the area prepared by the municipality or county. Mr. Hardy had been looking over Frank's shoulder. Very good, son, he commented. To Chet, he said, remember, every investigator must carry a notebook and a pencil. He must never rely on memory. From the minute he arrives at the scene, he should be busy writing, recording the time of day, date, location, weather, and details of the area, people present, and anything else he believes pertinent to the investigation. There is no substitute for note-taking. For instance, when the weather is an important part of the evidence and the camera cannot show it in a crime scene photo, the investigator must make notes on this fact. Chet sighed, overwhelmed by all the new information. I wish we had a case right now in which I could use everything I just learned, he said. Mr. Hardy smiled. You may get your wish one of these days, Chet. There's always something. He was interrupted by the telephone and picked it up. Benton Hardy speaking. Yes, Captain Abbott. Yes, I understand. Okay, we'll be right there. He hung up and turned to the boys. A big burglary at the Rex Manufacturing Company on the edge of town. Make sure all the equipment is in the car. Chet, you're getting your wish already. On the way to the Rex Company, the detective told the boys that Chief Colleague was on vacation and Captain Abbott was acting in his place. $7,500 in cash and about as much in gold and silver have been stolen from Rex, Mr. Hardy added, by a person or persons who gained entry through a window which had been broken. The Hardys and their friends were met outside the building by Captain Abbott and the president of the firm, Charles Willits, who was pale and shaken. Mr. Willett said to Mr. Hardy, please help me. This will ruin our business. Our insurance is not sufficient to cover this loss. We'll do everything in our power to find the burglars, Mr. Hardy assured the man. Tell us what happened. Last night, Mr. Willits began, I left the office later than usual after everyone was gone. I was checking on some shipments. Business had been slow, but it was just beginning to improve. I hurried home because I expected guests for dinner. They stayed late, but after they left, my mind went back to business. Suddenly, I was not sure whether I had closed the safe. I often forgot before, but never worried because there was little cash on hand. Yesterday, however, I did business with a new firm for the first time. When I checked their credit rating, I insisted upon payment in cash. That's the reason I had so much here. He continued, "About 2 o'clock this morning, I drove to the factory. I thought I saw a light flash in the office as I approached, but then dismissed the idea, thinking my imagination was playing tricks." Mr. Willett stopped to mop his forehead, then went on. "I unlocked the door and reached for the light switch. 2 men suddenly jumped on me. They bound me with rope hand and foot and gagged me. Then they threw me in that old closet at the end of the hall. I didn't see their faces because my eyes had not grown accustomed to the dark. I know that one of them was huge and strong. I could tell by the way he handled me. It's a big closet with a strong lock. We used to keep gold and silver in it before we built the bigger storeroom." "Why do you keep precious metals here?" inquired Captain Abbott. "We make gold and silver eyeglass frames." What a stupid business model. "Of course," Mr. Hardy said. "Please tell us more." "Well," Mr. Willets continued, "I lay there for hours. Finally, my secretary arrived for work and opened the door. She called one of the workers and he untied me. I checked the safe. It was open and the money was gone. None of the desks had been ransacked and everything else seemed to be in order. Then I suddenly remembered the gold and silver. I went to the security room. It had been broken open. One look inside and I could see that the metal had been stolen." "What has been done so far?" Mr. Hardy asked Captain Abbott. "The crime scene has been protected. Higgins is taking photographs right now." "Good. Let's go inside." Fenton Hardy beckoned the 3 boys to follow him. Then he paused in the doorway and seemed to be taking a mental picture of the room. He whipped out his notebook and jotted something down. "Chet," he said, "there's no better time to learn them right now. Joe, bring the crime scene kit in, will you? Give Chet a clipboard, some paper, a notebook, a pencil, and go to work. On second thought, you and Chet go outside and make a sketch of the window which was smashed by the burglars and whatever else seems relevant." Mr. Hardy also took a clipboard and placed graph paper on it. Then he helped Captain Abbott and Frank to measure the location of the essential evidence in the room. When they were finished, the captain asked Officer Rinshaw to adjust for prints. Fenton Hardy now went to the storeroom from which the gold and silver had been stolen. He looked about but found no clues. As he left the room, he asked Mr. Willets, "Are there any containers missing in which the metal might have been carried out?" "Oh," Mr. Willets replied, "they took it in the chest it was stored in." Mr. Hardy said thoughtfully. "Please give me a description of it." He made notes as Mr. Willets replied that the box was made of steel about 2 feet deep, 4 feet long, and 1 foot wide. It had handles on each end and was locked with a key. "How about the color?" the detective asked. "Steel gray." Just then Chet rushed up. "Mr. Hardy, we found a tool which was used to smash the window. Come with me." Chet led the way to the street and pointed to the gutter. In it lay a pick handle. "Nice going, Chet. Photograph it and sketch it on your graph paper. Then it will be dusted for prints by Rinshaw and secured for evidence." Mr. Hardy turned to the captain and said, "We'll be glad to help you make a crime scene search outdoors." "Fine," the captain said, and ordered his men to line up across the street from the factory and spread out about an arm's length apart. "We'll walk up to the building," he said, "go around it, and then line up the same way on the other side." "Chet," said Mr. Hardy. "Wait, they're just going to let Chet be in the..." "Okay." "Chet," said Mr. Hardy, "let me give you a few basic rules that must be obeyed. The most important thing is search discipline. Everyone must observe everything around him on the ground or in the trees, very careful. The men will walk abreast of each other, in a straight line. Only in this way can a proper systematic search be conducted. Any questions?" "What are they going to look for?" Chet asked. "Just about anything, including shoe prints." Captain Abbott was instructing his men as the Hardys and Chet joined him. "If you locate something," he said, "hold up your hand to attract attention. Don't touch it." "The reason for this," Mr. Hardy told Chet, "is that its location must be charted on a sketch, and if it's an article that the thieves might have dropped, it has to be dusted for fingerprints." Now the line of policemen. What about the search? The line of policemen and teenagers and private detective. As they neared the edge of the woods. Now the line of policemen went about the search. The turning point would be just beyond a small ridge about 200 feet into the woods, which stretched behind the Rex Manufacturing Company. As they neared the edge of the woods, Chet Morton held up his hand and yelled excitedly, "Here, here!" "What is it?" Captain Abbott asked. "A broken pencil. Maybe it doesn't mean anything." "Even a seemingly insignificant article may turn out to be a vital clue," Captain Abbott told him. "Good work, Chet." Mr. Hardy made a note, marked the location of the yellow pencil in his sketch, and then picked it up. The search party went on. They had almost reached the turning point when Joe suddenly shouted from a patch of woods, "Here it is!" Mr. Hardy and Captain Abbott quickly walked to the location. On the ground lay the stolen metal chest. Joe removed the broken branches which partially concealed it and found it still intact. Mr. Hardy and Captain Abbott decided that all the officers would be instructed to maintain silence concerning the discovery of the chest. Most of them were sent to their routine duties. Officer Rinshaw carefully dusted the chest for latent fingerprints. Many were found, and after they had been photographed and lifted, the chest was moved to police headquarters. An identical chest was obtained from the local hardware store, filled with rocks, and placed where the stolen chest had been discovered. Chet was full of curiosity. "What's going on, fellows?" he asked. "Dad and Captain Abbott are going to set up what is termed a plant," Joe replied. "I was a plant once. Back in my engineering days, I was a good plant. I was a fun plant. Not like this plant. This isn't a fun plant." Police will be detailed to watch and see if an attempt is made to pick up the phony chest. "That's right," Chet joined in Mr. Hardy. "2 officers will be hidden in the shrubbery at all times, and if someone comes for the chest, he'll be apprehended. Now, I think we better go to the police identification division to see if Rinshaw has come up with anything." Upon their arrival at headquarters, Rinshaw informed Mr. Hardy and Captain Abbott that there were several sets of prints on the chest. He had found upon comparison that some were Mr. Willett's. However, he was unable to make any other identification. He also told them that there were some latent prints on the pick handle that had matched the unidentifiable ones on the chest. Mr. Hardy nodded, then read over his notes. Chet approached him. "Would you look at my sketch, Mr. Hardy?" "Sure." The detective took the boy's chart and examined it. Suddenly he exclaimed, "Chet, do you mean to tell me there's a lot of broken glass on the outside of this window?" "That's right, a lot of it. Why?" "All right, say it with me. Why is this important? Because if a window has glass on the outside, that means it was broken from the inside." Mr. Hardy did not answer, but looked at his own sketch carefully. Then he said in a surprised voice, "That's odd. It looks as if the window was smashed from the inside. I wonder." His voice trailed off in silence. Then he studied his son's sketches. "Frank," he asked, "how about this car near the curb down the street?" "I saw it parked there," Frank replied, "so I placed it on the chart." "Too bad we didn't pay attention to it sooner," Mr. Hardy remarked. "Do you have any notes on it?" Frank took out his pad, and after scanning it, he said, "The hood was up. I wrote down the license number." Mr. Hardy turned to the captain. "It's just a hunch, but we'd better check with the Motor Vehicle Bureau and find out who owns the car." Abbott nodded and had one of his officers send out a teletype. Frank, meanwhile, continued to scan his notes. Then he said, During our search, a wrecker from the Triangle Towing Services hoisted the front end of the car. I saw a man talking with the mechanic." "I think we ought to follow this up," Mr. Hardy said. "Captain, let's take a ride to the towing service. Come on, boys." At the Triangle Garage, Captain Abbott did most of the talking. From the mechanic, they learned that he had received a call requesting that he tow a car from the vicinity of the Rex Company. When he arrived there, he recognized the automobile as belonging to William Tiller, the firm's bookkeeper. Tiller asked him to find the cause of the trouble. After a brief examination, the mechanic told him that the coil was not functioning. He offered to pick up a new one and replace it, but the bookkeeper insisted that he tow the car to the garage at once, even though he would have to pay a towing fee. Tiller waited for his car to be repaired. He was obviously in a hurry and explained that Mr. Willits wanted him to make an important trip. He had the tank filled and the oil checked. After paying the bill, he departed quickly. "All right, I'm putting all my money in on insurance fraud." When the mechanic had finished, Fenton Hardy walked over to the telephone booth. He dialed a number and spoke rapidly to somebody. Then he told the others, "I talked to Mr. Willits. He said Tiller disappeared from the office just before we started the search." Willits did not pay much attention to the fact and emphasized that Tiller is a trusted employee. He had a key to the office door and obviously often worked on the books at night. Mr. Willits denied, however, that he had sent the man on a trip. "Tiller lives in a furnished room at 12 West Street. Let's go over and talk to him right away." They were proceeding to West Street when Frank said, "Look, that's the car that was parked down the street from the Rex Company. It's coming towards us." "Let it pass, then turn around quick," Captain Abbott ordered his driver. "The man who's driving it is the one I saw talking to the mechanic," Frank cried out. "No doubt it's Tiller," muttered Captain Abbott. "He sure is in a hurry." Tiller poured on the gas. "Captain," said Mr. Hardy, "let's give him the siren so he'll stop." The shrieking sound had the opposite effect on Tiller. He increased his speed, but the squad car gained. Finally, the skillful driving of the police chauffeur convinced Tiller that escape was impossible, and he came to a stop on the shoulder of the road. As the police car halted slightly to the rear, the officer driving opened his door and covered Tiller from behind it with a service revolver. Captain Abbott, with gun drawn, cautiously approached the suspect's car from the right rear. He ordered in a loud, clear voice, "Put your hands over your head." Tiller obeyed. The police chauffeur walked towards the suspect's car and swung open the driver's door. "Keep your hands on your head and step out," he said. Then he told Tiller to face his car and sidestep to the right until he stood next to the police sedan. Tiller, a slight man, reluctantly complied, his shrewd eyes dartingly examining the situation. He was obviously seeking some sort of avenue of escape. Or he's just nervous. Captain Abbott holstered his weapon and said, "Tiller, make no move unless I tell you. Now slowly place your hands on the edge of the car roof and spread them out as far apart as possible. All right, now shuffle your feet back as far as you can and spread them apart." After the suspect had complied, Captain Abbott hooked his left foot in front of Tiller's left foot and forced his legs even farther apart. This placed Tiller off balance and gave him the minimum chance to turn and assault the police officer. The chauffeur moved slightly behind Tiller, gun in hand. He stationed himself in a way that the captain would not be in the line of fire if the suspect made an attempt to get away. Frank, Joe, and Chet were watching from inside the police cars. Captain Abbott began to search the suspect. "Chet," Frank said, "this is called a wall search. It is a preliminary search, and the officer looks for drugs or weapons that the suspect might use to injure himself or the officer. Once the suspect is in this position with his hands on the car or against a wall, the officer begins either on the left or the right side. Captain Abbott is starting on the left. When he goes to the right, you will note that he'll walk behind the chauffeur so as to not pass between the suspect and the gun." Chet nodded, and Frank went on. "Here's what you do step by step. 1. Slide your left foot in front of the suspect's left leg and inside his left foot. Exert a slight knee pressure against the front of his leg. When you search the right side, you'll use your right foot. This position will enable you to sense and counteract a movement by the suspect. 2. Search the suspect's headgear. 3. Examine mouth, nose, ear, hair, and palm of left hand. 4. Start at left wrist and with both hands feel for any foreign object which might be in the suspect's clothing or strapped to his skin. Probe to the shoulder. 5. Search around his shoulder, around his neck, the front portion of his body, the side of his body, and his back. Pay special attention to the area between the shoulder blades and the small of the back." I will add that, that is a place where, often knives are strapped in the hollow area. Or alcohol bottles. If you're dealing with drunk university students. 6. Search his waistline by removing his belt and examining the inside of the trouser waistband. Step 7. Search in the groin area and down the suspect's left leg, pull his sock down and feel inside his shoe top. 4. Repeat the same process on the suspect's other side. Some areas will overlap. 9. Empty all pockets. See, I don't understand why they do pockets last. We always did, again, obviously, I'm not a cop. I was a security guard. And I mostly did bar security and event security with a bunch of drunk college students who tried to bring in free alcohol because they were stupid. But we started with pockets. And in fact, if you had pockets, you had to turn them out yourself. Obviously, in this case, when they're dealing with the suspect, the police, in this case, don't want that person to be using their hands and turning out their own pockets. I get that. But, I would start with the pockets, because if you're gonna find a weapon, start at the most obvious place, I would say. Alright, okay. One more thing, Frank added. Don't pat, but feel your way over the suspect's body. This way, thin, flat objects won't be missed. What do you do with the stuff you find? Chet asked. Whatever is convenient, Frank said. Weapons you retain on your person, other items you place on the roof of the car or on the ground. Later they are placed in an envelope or bag. After you search, you handcuff the man and take him to headquarters. There he will be subject to a very thorough strip search and his clothing will be examined carefully. Suppose you don't have a second officer available to cover the suspect with his gun while you search. Then you hold your gun in one hand while searching with the other, Frank said. That sounds like an absolute recipe for disaster. I hate it. What if you have two prisoners? In that case, one must be flat on his stomach with his arms extended forward, palms flat on the ground. Then you conduct your search with the method I just described. When you're finished with the first suspect, you handcuff him, force him to lie down, and search the other man. While Frank had been talking, Captain Abbott had removed a fully loaded automatic from Tiller's belt and handed it to his colleague. When the prisoner was handcuffed, a careful search was made of the car. You've got nothing on me, copper, Tiller snarled, except carrying that gun, and I can explain that. Yeah, it's America. We all can explain that. No one made any comment. The car yielded no clues, and the captain appeared puzzled. Did you find anything important besides the gun? Mr. Hardy asked. No. All he has on him is his wallet, with personal credit cards, some bills, change, a comb, a ballpoint pen, and a broken pencil. A broken pencil? Chet shouted excitedly. All looked up in surprise. Captain Abbott caught on and said, Of course, I forgot all about that. This broken pencil is yellow, just like the other one, and I'll bet all the tea in China that this will match that piece that we found. Mr. Hardy opened the trunk of the car again. After looking around carefully, he leaned on the spare tire and found out that it was not inflated. He took it out and forced it away from the rim. Everyone gasped. A mass of bills and checks spilled out. Wow! Chet's eyes bulged in amazement. Who would have thought of that? Tiller was advised of his constitutional rights as an arrested person and then taken to police headquarters. The others followed. Here they learned that the policeman hidden in the woods had apprehended a man named Ford Williams when he attempted to pick up the steel chest. Williams had already confessed his part in the crime. He had known Tiller in New York City. Both had criminal records and had been in jail together. About 5 years ago, the two men had committed a burglary. Williams was apprehended, but Tiller escaped. The bookkeeper, whose real name was Hans Schinner, had used the alias of William Tiller and had come to Bayport. Shortly after his arrival, he was employed by Mr. Willits. Williams had served almost 5 years for his crime. Upon being released, he had been contacted by Tiller, who told him that Willits was an easy target and that the town's police were hicks. The previous night, he had received a telephone call from Tiller to come to Bayport immediately. He told Williams that he had staked out the factory, waited till Mr. Willits left, and made sure that the safe had been left open. The two burglars had entered the building with Tiller's key and rifled the unlocked safe. They had just broken the lock on the storeroom door when they noticed the glare of oncoming headlights. Then Mr. Willits opened the door and reached for the light switch. The powerful Williams seized on him. He was bound and thrown into the closet. In order to give the impression of a forced entry, Tiller smashed the window from inside the building with a pick handle. When they left, after locking the door again, Tiller threw the pick handle in the gutter. The thieves had loaded the chest into Tiller's car. It had refused to start. Tiller became panic-stricken at the thought of leaving the chest containing the gold and silver in the car at the scene. So he and Williams carried the chest to the woods. Then they deflated Tiller's spare tire and stuffed the currency and checks inside. Williams had gone to a hotel for the rest of the night, and the following day, it was planned that the car would be repaired and the chest picked up that evening after working hours. Then the two men would leave Bayport. Tiller, however, changed his mind when he realized that the employees would obviously be questioned by the police. He had tried to have his car picked up before daybreak, but no luck. The Triangle Garage had promised to send a man early in the morning. Tiller waited, but the man did not show up before the company opened. He went to work, keeping an eye on the car. When the tow truck arrived, he slipped out, had the car removed, and was planning to leave town without Williams as soon as the repairs were finished. Williams, in turn, was unable to reach Tiller by telephone and had become suspicious. He had returned alone to the spot where they had left the chest and walked right into the arms of the police. Captain Abbott commented, "This illustrates the old saying, there's no honor among thieves." The next morning, the three Hardys and Chet Morton were again seated in Mr. Hardy's study. All were in good humor, chatting about their exploits of the previous day. "I think Chet has graduated from the recruit class," Mr. Hardy said with a twinkle. Then he added, "Chet, I'm proud of you. Be ready to help us solve the next mystery." All right, it is 9 o'clock, but we are going to finish this insane book tonight. So bear with me, readers, as I hydrate like my life depends on it, because it probably does. So, like, they brought in Tony Prudo at one point, because they can't just have Chet. Like, they have to remind you that they actually have other friends besides Chet. They have one other friend, it's Tony Perito. But, like, in the books, Chet is, like, the big dumb friend. And I will, this is a great as time as any to point out and critique the highly problematic association that this series always put with weight and intelligence. So that was just some nice fat phobia that was coded into these books. It's a great right there. Love that. But because Chet is the author avatar, is the audience avatar in this particular series, he is both dumber than he comes off in the original books, because he's asking so many basic leading questions so that Frank and Joe can, like, fill in. And, like, it comes off as kind of unnatural just because if you've read the books, like, Chet isn't this dumb. Like, he's dumb. But he's not, like, this basic. But then, because it's written for kids who want to be detectives and they want to make them feel good, because he's the audience avatar, he ends up, like, he starts off the first chapter not really knowing anything, and then in this chapter he, like, finds the clue that broke the case. Oh, and in the murder chapter he, like, was 100% the person who solved the suspect. So he, like, in the books he's this kind of, like, he's this lovable blundering sidekick who helps Frank and Joe but never, like, actually helps them, or, like, he'll do something dumb and stupid and make a mistake and then they'll figure out the case because, like, he stumbled into it. But in this, like, he goes from being absolutely clueless to the point that it's ridiculous to solving the cases because he is the audience avatar and the audience wants to be the one who solved the case and feel like they figured it out. All right, let's finish this book. I'm enjoying this. Like, I'm making fun of it, and I'm definitely enjoying it in a completely different way. Like, as a kid, I was 100% buying what this book was selling. Like, I'm gonna grow up and I'm gonna be a detective and I'm gonna be so good. And now all cops are bad, and don't really need to say anything more about that. But I'm still enjoying reading this because, you know, growing up before the internet and now with the internet being so ubiquitous, it's like when I was growing up, none of this seemed all that weird. We had digital cameras, but they weren't that great, and most police departments were still using film, and now it's like, where are the smartphones? Where is the internet? Why are they still sending telegrams? What is going on? Chapter 7, The Trail Beyond the Smoke Screen. Surveillance. Fenton Hardy was pacing his room at a large hotel in Newark, New Jersey, when a knock sounded on the door. He opened it. Outside stood Frank and Joe and their chum, Chet Morton. "Hey, Dad," Joe said, grinning. "Surprised to see us?" "Sure am," Mr. Hardy replied. "Mother told us you were here," Frank said, "and we drove down. You've been on this assignment for 9 days, and we thought there might be something we could do." Isn't their mother dead? I thought their mom was dead and they had a housekeeper. Or is that actually, no, that might be Nancy Drew. They might actually have a mom who's alive now that I'm thinking of it. I might be mixing them up with Nancy Drew. Okay, all right. Well, in this book they have a mom. So, "Mother told us you were here," Frank said, "and we drove down. You've been on this assignment for 9 days, and we thought there might be something we could do." "Thanks," the detective smiled, but then a frown clouded his face. "This is a really tough case. If they're going to New Jersey, why didn't they take Tony Perito? Like, he's the street smart one. Like, okay, all right. Judging their choice here, but okay. This is a really tough case. I'm up against the wall." "Can we help you?" Chet asked. "I'm afraid not," Mr. Hardy replied. "Can you tell us about it?" Frank inquired. Mr. Hardy nodded. "I've been engaged by a famous national jewelry corporation to investigate the theft of thousands of dollars worth of merchandise from their showroom in New York City." Ah, the days before NDAs. "The trail led to Newark." The police here are cooperating as much as they can, even though the actual crime took place in another state. So far, the police have located 7 pieces of stolen jewelry in Newark pawn shops. The pawnbrokers recorded the name, address, and physical descriptions of the person who pawned them. The names and addresses in all cases were the same and proved to be fictitious, but a comparison of the descriptions confirms my and the police's suspicion about the thief's identity. Who is he? Frank wanted to know. A junior officer of the jewelry company. Then why hasn't he been arrested? Joe asked. We decided to hold off and try to recover the jewelry. The police go along with me in my plans. I must find out where it is, and also make sure that the suspect is the actual thief. Why don't you tail him, Mr. Hardy? Chet asked. He knows me by sight. I've tried using other detectives, but no luck. This guy's clever and suspicious. There was a moment of gloomy silence. Then Joe said, Why don't you give us a chance at it, Dad? He'd never suspect that we boys were tailing him. That's right, Frank broke in enthusiastically. You know, we've done surveillance in almost every case we've worked on. Mr. Hardy thought for a moment and then said, You know, this might not be a bad idea. Great, Frank said. Let's get started. Wait a minute. The first thing you'll have to do is call Mother. Tell her you're spending a couple of days with me. Chet also had better call home. The boys grinned. We have told her already. Mrs. Morton, too, Frank explained. Oh? Mr. Hardy kept a straight face. Then he phoned the desk clerk and obtained an adjoining room for the boys. After a quick lunch in the hotel's restaurant, they all went to Mr. Hardy's room to plan their strategy. I'll tell you all the important aspects of the case, Mr. Hardy said. Ask questions any time. He settled into a lounge chair and began. 10 days ago, there was a fire in the company's store in New York City. It flared up suddenly in a bundle of cleaning rags stored in a large closet under a stairway. It was a heavy, smoke-laden fire which spread rapidly. Customers and employees fled to the street. Someone tried the fire extinguisher near the closet, but it didn't work, and he called the fire department. It was a stubborn blaze, but they confined it to the stairway area and finally put it out. Mr. Hardy glanced from one boy to another and went on. All the personnel returned to the store afterwards. At first, it was believed that the fire had been caused by paints and chemicals stored in the closet. But the fire chief was suspicious. He called the arson squad to make an investigation. The trio listened intently as Mr. Hardy continued. That evening, when the employees began to lock up the jewelry, one of the most trusted salesmen reported the disappearance of an entire tray of diamond jewelry. It was valued at more than $100,000. This is not the time for me to go on a rant about why diamonds are stupid. This is not the time. This is not the time. Come find me on Twitter if you want to hear all my opinions on why diamonds are stupid. Come at me. I have so many opinions. I have so many opinions. All right, but, you know, it was valued at more than $100,000. The police, the FBI, and the insurance company were immediately notified, and liaison will be maintained. The search of the premises by the arson squad and detectives turned up the missing tray, which was partially consumed inside the burned closet, but none of the jewelry was found. Samples of ashes, remnants of rags, and other burned materials were taken to the laboratory for examination, as well as a glassine envelope which contained traces of a white powder. The envelope was found in a waste paper basket in the men's room. The next day, another minute search of the store for the jewelry was made and proved unsuccessful. It was at that time that the arson squad notified Kenneth Craig, the president of the concern, that the fire had been deliberately set. The lab examination determined that the rags had been impregnated with paints and gasoline before the fire was started. Also, it was found that the substance in the glassine envelope was heroin. As a result, the New York City Police Department Narcotics Bureau entered the case. It was at this point that I was called into the case by Mr. Craig. What did you do first? Frank asked. I interviewed every employee and officer of the company, as well as every customer present when the fire started, and all the firemen who fought the blaze. The firemen, too? Chet exclaimed in surprise. I would have never thought of that. We ruled out the firemen as possible suspects, Mr. Hardy continued, because none of them had been near the section from which the jewels were missing. But Dad, interrupted Frank, how about the clerk in charge of the section where the jewelry was stolen? Didn't he notice anything unusual? I'm getting to that. His name was Jerome Dempster. He told us that he had just put that particular tray back into the showcase when the fire was discovered. He hurried to the closet in an effort to put out the blaze with the fire extinguisher, but it did not work. He subsequently called the fire department. Then he tried to go back to the closet, blinded by the smoke and forced to move to the street door. He remembered seeing Ronald Lackey, a junior vice president in the company, near his section when the fire started. Later, when he turned back from the exit, he thought he noticed Lackey near the closet, but was not sure because of the smoke. "Excuse me, Dad," cut in Joe, "but have you made a background investigation of the staff?" "Yes. I've checked to see if there was anyone with a police record, but the results were negative. I also checked credit companies and neighbors and found out that all the personnel live conventional lives, with the possible exception of Ronald Lackey, who owes large sums of money." "But Mr. Hardy," Chet burst out, "you said that he's an officer of the company. How could he be a thief?" "Well, my boy," the detective said, "just because Lackey's a vice president doesn't necessarily mean he's honest. All we know is what the evidence indicates. I haven't said that he stole the jewels, but I'm pretty sure, no, he's not even sure. He's certain that he pawned some of them." "You mean the pawnbroker's description of their customer fits him?" "Right. I showed them his photograph, and 3 of the shopkeepers were pretty sure that Lackey was the man who pawned the jewels." "Dad, you're great," Frank said admiringly. "But why did you suspect him in the first place?" "Well, he had some rather large debts. Then I found out that he was dismissed from college for stealing money from the room of a fellow student. The student didn't press charges, so Lackey has no police record." Okay, if large debts were all it took to become a jewel thief, every single college student in America would be a jewel thief right now. I'd be a jewel thief right now. And I'm not. I'm really not, I swear. Although if I was, would I admit it on my Twitch stream? Probably not. But like, oh, it gets worse. I also found out by a search of the court records that his wife was recently granted a divorce on a charge of desertion. At the present time, he is living alone in a studio apartment in the suburbs of Newark. He doesn't have to pay alimony and only has himself to support. His salary is considerable, and I wondered why all these debts. Frank nodded. "It certainly seems odd." "How long has he been an officer of Towers?" Joe asked. "About 2 years. You see, it's this way. Ronald Lackey's father married Mr. Craig's sister." So it's nepotism. It's nepotism. "They started a jewelry company, worked hard, and prospered. About 3 years ago, Lackey's father got him a job with the firm, even though Mr. Craig, his uncle, was not too happy about it. For about a year, Lackey was the public relations manager for the company and did very well. He was married that year. Because of his good record and, I suppose, some influence of his father." You suppose? Some influence of his father? You suppose? "He was made a junior vice president. Soon after that, his troubles began. He had difficulties with his marriage, began to drink, gambled, and kept questionable company. His father was forced to pay his debts to avoid a scandal. About 8 months ago, his father died. There was hardly any estate left because of his son's demands. Mr. Craig is disgusted with his nephew, but keeps him in the firm to avoid hurting his sister, who has been ill for a long time." "He sure sounds like an unstable character," Joe said. "Let's go to work on him right away. How about searching his apartment?" "Yes, Dad," Frank put in. "Certainly the information from the pawnbrokers would be sufficient to obtain a warrant." "None of them made a positive identification." Mr. Hardy got up, paced around the room, and continued. "I interviewed Lackey's former wife. She told me that her husband had started to use marijuana shortly after their marriage." Oh, wait, and they found heroin at the scene. Okay, so they're going to say marijuana is a gateway drug, right? That's where this is going? Okay, all is right with the world. "She believes that he's using stronger drugs and thinks that he buys them from a young man named Dale Britt, who came to their apartment for short visits prior to their separation. Mrs. Lackey identified a Newark police mugshot of Dale Britt as the man. Also, the doorman at Lackey's apartment house identified Dale Britt's photograph as that of a frequent caller who had stopped his visits only recently." "Boy," Frank said, "this will be a dangerous assignment if it involves narcotic addicts." "Right," Mr. Hardy agreed. "For that reason, I want you to be very careful. I'm not sure that Lackey is an addict, but I strongly suspect it. He seems the type who could easily become a victim of this terrible kind of slavery. I can't think of a worse fate to befall any human being. An addict will steal or commit other crimes, even murder, to get the stuff." The 3 boys sat in silence on the edge of their chairs, staring at the detective. They had never seen him so aroused about any subject. Finally, Mr. Hardy pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and took out 2 photographs. This is Lackey, and that's Britt. Study the pictures well so you will recognize these men immediately. Frank, Joe, and Chet followed his advice and passed the photographs around. Ronald Lackey was a homely man of 29, slight of build with an obstinate expression. He had thinning light hair, large protruding eyes, a hawk nose, beady eyes, thin lips, a receding chin, and a prominent Adam's apple. What an awful set of genes this person has. The other photo showed a young man about 23 years old, slender. That is so specific. Okay, 23 years old, slender, with long wavy hair and prominent sideburns. He had a low brow, deep-set eyes, long, thin nose, large mouth, and a sharp chin. Dale Britt is a convicted heroin addict. Okay, you can't convict somebody of being a heroin addict. You can convict them for possession of heroin, and you can convict them for dealing, but you cannot convict someone for being a heroin addict. That's not a thing. Once the heroin is inside you, they can't do anything about it. Dale Britt is a convicted heroin addict, Mr. Hardy explained. He also had a criminal record dating back to his teens for purse snatching, burglary, and auto theft. He is wanted right now by the police as a parole violator. Quite a record, Joe muttered. Mr. Hardy said. Now, here's where you come in. I've learned that Lackey leaves his office in New York about 5 p.m. He generally eats a very light dinner at a small restaurant near the store. Sometimes he doesn't eat at all. Then he takes a train which leaves him off about half a mile from his apartment. He sold his car recently and walks home. What does he do at night? Frank asked. I'm coming to that. Lately, he never has any company. He goes out every night, but at no specific times. Some evenings he departs a few minutes after he gets home, while other times he leaves late. Do you know where he goes? Frank asked. He takes a bus to Newark and always gets off at the same intersection. This is where my operatives have failed in their surveillance. They have never been able to follow him to his destination. He's used every trick to lose them. He has stopped at a store and doubled back, pretended to wait for a bus, and has used other similar tactics. He seems to sense that he's being tailed. When he becomes suspicious, he'll jump onto a bus or hail a taxi. Anyway, he disappears and then returns to his apartment very late. But Mr. Hardy, Chet said with a frown, do you have any idea whom he goes to see? I suspect that he's visiting Dale Britt, but I have no facts to substantiate this. How about staking out Dale's house? Joe suggested. The police do not know where Britt lives. Where do we go from here, then? Frank asked. Joe spoke up. In tailing Lackey, I think the 3-man surveillance would be the best. Right, Joe, chimed in Frank. Don't you agree, Dad? Sure do. You'll start tonight. Wait a minute, said Chet. I don't know how 3-man surveillance works. I'll explain it to you, Frank said. It's easy. The procedure in this type of shadowing is for 3 detectives to be scattered near the place where they expect to see the suspect. The first sleuth walks a reasonable distance behind him. The second follows the first, and in turn, the third follows the second. Anytime the first detective feels that he is suspected, he gives a hand signal to the second man, and then he either crosses the street or stops at a store window or slips into some alley. The second man takes his place. The first man finally falls behind the third detective. They continue to rotate until the surveillance is completed. Another thing, Joe put in, if the suspect gets to a street intersection and makes a left or right turn or walks into a building, the first detective keeps right on walking. The next detective then makes the turn or follows the suspect into the building. That sounds easy, Chet commented. Mr. Hardy laughed. Yes, but you've got to be prepared for the unexpected. The suspect might jump into a bus or a taxi. In that case, the second man tailing him gets into the bus or continues the surveillance by taxi. Always be sure you have enough money with you. What time do we start? Frank asked, looking at his father. I suggest you station yourselves near the intersection where Lackey gets off the bus downtown. Be there about 6:30 p.m. Since he always goes home first, he won't show up until 6:45 at the earliest. Joe, you be the first shadow. Loiter nonchalantly as close to the bus stop as possible. Frank, you take the second spot, and Chet the third. Is everything clear? Yes, all 3 said excitedly. Will you be anywhere near us? Chet asked. You bet, Mr. Hardy said. I'll be in an unmarked police car with the Narcotics Bureau detectives. You're not to take any risks. I want you to remember this. If any of you sees that one of the other boys is in trouble, walk out into the street and hold both arms straight up in the air. We'll always be within sight of you." "Okay," said Chet. At 6:30 p.m., the trio arrived at the designated place, and each boy stationed himself at a different spot. 2 hours went by. Bus after bus discharged passengers, but Lackey was not among them. Finally, the man alighted from one of the local buses. He stopped to light a cigarette and glanced up and down the street. Apparently satisfied that he was not being observed, he walked along the street at a moderate pace. Joe, who had been idling on the bottom step of a nearby porch, went after him. Frank and Chet fell in line and followed. The police radio car was some distance behind Chet. At the next intersection, Lackey paused to tie a shoelace and looked around apprehensively. Joe walked past him and continued on. The suspect then made a right turn, and Frank took up their surveillance. Joe fell in behind Chet later. Lackey passed 2 more intersections, then stopped again. He lighted another cigarette while looking quickly up and down the street. He turned right again. Frank kept on going straight. It was Chet's turn to tail the man now. Chet had been walking at a moderate pace and had not expected Lackey to change his speed, but when he arrived at the corner, he could not see Lackey and experienced a sickening feeling of failure. However, he realized that the man could not have gone far and signaled Joe to proceed to the corner. Chet stopped in front of the 3rd building on the block and listened. Hearing voices in the alleyway, he decided to investigate. He signaled Joe to wait at the entrance of the alley. The building was old and dilapidated. Chinks of light filtered through holes in the shades. Chet tiptoed along the alley. The voices he heard were now distinct. A man pleaded, "Gimme some of the stuff. I need it quick, please. Don't stall, Lazar. You've got all the jewelry now." Chet recognized the speaker through a hole in the shade of the nearest window. Ronald Lackey. He was sitting at the kitchen table. Then a raspy voice taunted, "Look at him, the big executive. He'll do anything we say for the stuff. We're gonna own Towers soon. Okay, Dale, let him have a fix and keep him quiet." "Easy, Ron. We'll take care of ya." Chet figured it was Dale Britt speaking. At that moment, the boy moved so that he could see better through the peephole. And as he did, he accidentally kicked an empty soda bottle, which broke with a crash. In trying to escape, he stumbled. Before he knew it, he was grabbed by 2 strong, rough hands. He managed to yell for help, but he was dragged into the kitchen. Ah, Chet, the hostage. Now we have returned to sanity. Now we have returned to the normal series where Frank and Joe solve the crimes and Chet is the blundering idiot who ends up being the hostage. Chet was knocked into a chair by a hairy thug. "What were you doing in the alley?" demanded the raspy-voiced man, who Chet assumed was Lazar. "Make sure you tell the truth or I'll break every bone in your body." Nothing, Chet replied shakily. "I was just going for a walk and got lost." "Where do you live?" Britt asked sharply. I'm from out of town. Right now I'm staying with a friend on Ivy Hill Avenue. I came up to ask directions." Chet was desperately trying to stall for time, knowing that Joe would get help. You see, if you could only tell me how to get to Pennsylvania Station, I could find my way." "You must be a stool pigeon," the hairy thug rasped. "Now tell us the truth, or we'll—" Just then, the alley door was smashed in by Mr. Hardy and 2 Narcotics Bureau detectives. "The cops! Beat it!" Britt yelled. He raced towards the front door, but was stopped by Frank, Joe, and another narcotics detective, who promptly searched and handcuffed him. Then he was led back to the kitchen. Lazar and Lackey sat handcuffed on chairs, the picture of dejection. "Who's he?" Frank asked, pointing to the hairy thug. "His name's Lazar," Lieutenant Wilson from the Narcotics Bureau explained. "He pulled a knife, but didn't get very far. He kept looking at the refrigerator and led us right to the evidence. We found a small .32 caliber automatic between 2 slices of bread. In the crisper were bags of heroin worth $50,000 on the retail market, and hidden in the freezer was some very expensive jewelry." As Lieutenant Wilson advised the 3 captives of their rights, Mr. Hardy said, "Now we just have to clear up the New York angle. How about giving us your story, Mr. Lackey?" Mr. Lackey, who refused a lawyer. Oh my goodness. Okay, so the only person in this entire... I need to find his name now. Findale. That was him. August Findale is the only person in this entire book who has the good sense to refuse to talk before he has a lawyer. And I think even in the end, he ends up confessing because everybody else flips on him, and then he's just like, okay, well, whatever. But every criminal in this book is stupid and refuses a lawyer. Don't refuse a lawyer, kids. If you're ever in trouble, demand a lawyer. Cops are not your friends. Lackey, who refused a lawyer, said he was willing to make a statement. I know I won't get out of this, he said, so I might as well just tell you everything. I met Dale Britt just before I was made junior vice president of Towers. Dale introduced me to smoking grass and eventually to heroin. The more addicted I became, the more money it cost. Britt thought I was wealthy, but soon I could not raise any more. Right after I told him this, he arranged a meeting with Lazar. Lazar agreed to furnish me with junk provided I stole jewelry from Towers. He planned all the details of the theft. Lackey mopped his brow and took a deep breath. In the midst of the confusion during the fire, I went to Jerome's Dempster's counter, dumped the contents of one tray into a paper bag, and put it in my pocket. Then I walked to the closet, pretended I wanted to help put out the fire. I threw the tray into the flames. Earlier I had tampered with the fire extinguisher so it wouldn't work. Then I ran outside, met Britt as prearranged, and handed him the bag. The next day he gave me a few gems as my share. I pawned them because I had a lot of debts. Lackey, who had not had his promise fixed, perspired and started to shake. I can't do without the stuff, he moaned. Believe me, if I had known what I was getting into, I never would have touched it. You'll have to come with us, Lieutenant Wilson said. You'll be able to kick the habit if you really want to. It'll be rough, but you'll get all the help possible. Does that mean that you're not going to charge him? That you're just going to say, like, oh, well, it was fine, he was addicted, and these two guys made him do it? Like, does that mean he's getting off? Because if you're sending him to jail, he's not getting help. He's not getting help if you send him to jail. So what are you planning, Lieutenant Wilson? What are you planning? Lackey nodded, and Lieutenant Wilson led him outside. His two accomplices were already in the police car. Mr. Hardy and the boys said goodbye to Lieutenant Wilson and the other detectives. Then they took a taxi to their hotel. On the way, Chet said, Lackey was sure in bad shape. I never saw a guy who needed a fix. What a horrible thing to be addicted to drugs! You have been listening to A Book of Bedtime, a Storyranger Presents production. Tonight we read this trip of a book, near and dear to my heart because I did love it so much as a child, but it just goes off the rails at the end. It really does. It goes from teaching Chet how to take fingerprints and, like, dust for prints to catching a narcotics addict. And I know that it's because Chet is meant to be the audience avatar, and we need the progression of him from being completely useless to he caught the criminal. But it's just wild. It's just wild. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. Tonight we read The Hardy Boy Detective Handbook by Franklin W. Dixon. I have the 1969/1972 edition. Other editions exist. Let me know what you thought down in the comments below. Have a great rest of your week. And, all cops are bad. Headstrings